Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is John Burbank with the Medical Staffing Agency, and the purpose of today's call is to review our analysis of the medical staffing plan for the upcoming influenza season. Before we get started, I'd like to talk about a couple of the parameters of our analysis. Our goals were to satisfy local and state requirements for staffing during flu season, and we also want to minimize instances of over and understaffing. So with those two ideas in mind, we boil down our analysis into one question, and that is, how can we improve our staffing plan for flu season? Well, based upon the data that we had available, we were able to identify a vulnerable population, and we believe that this vulnerable population has a higher demand for our services, and therefore if we send our medical staff to states and areas with a larger amount of this population, then we will have a more efficient medical staffing plan that has lower instances of overstaffing and understaffing. We'll get to the analysis on how we reached our insights later in this presentation, but we did find that the most vulnerable population during flu season is the 65 plus population. Now, if you look at the graph on the bottom, you will see as the age range increases, so do the flu deaths by age group. And once we get to the 65 plus population, we can really see a dramatic increase in the number of deaths from 2009 to 2017. So this is a good indicator of the demand for our services being in the 65 plus population. And another thing I'd like to point out on this page is the graph right above it in the top right hand corner. I apologize for it being a little compressed. You may not be able to see the variation as much, but what this graph shows us is the total flu deaths by year from 2009 to 2017 nationwide. And one key thing to point out is that total flu deaths have not increased or decreased in consecutive years from 09 to 17. And so going off the prior year's flu death numbers could be misleading and lead to instances of over or understaffing. So I mentioned that we did an analysis to draw the insight that 65 plus populations are the hardest hit or the most vulnerable population during flu season. And this graph on the bottom left hand corner is a result of that analysis. So as you can see on the bottom, we have the 65 plus population increasing, and then on the top we have the flu deaths increasing as well. So as the size of the 65 plus population in the state increases, we also see an increase in the flu deaths, and we can see a really strong relationship between those two variables. So that gives us strong insight and understanding for the demand for our services. Based upon our analysis, the top 5 states for plus 65 population size and flu deaths are California, Texas, New York, Pennsylvania, and Florida. So those are just the top 5. We're concerned about all the states in the continental and outside, all 50 states, and we will be addressing their demand on the next slide as well. But it is important to know the top demand centers for, again, 65 plus population and for summer flu deaths in a season. Another thing I'd like to point out on this page that's super important is Vermont in the chart in the bottom right. So Vermont is this bigger green dot, and you can see how much larger it is compared to its peer states. What does this mean? What is this telling us? Well, if you look at the legend, you'll see that the larger the dot gets, the greater amount of death there is within the 65 population, which means that they have a higher death rate in the 65 plus population. So it's really important to factor this into the medical staffing plan as well, because a state like Vermont will not have a large total population. Therefore, they will not have a large sum of 65 plus population as well. And they are also unlikely to have a large sum of flu deaths because they have a smaller population compared to their peers. However, they do have a higher death rate in their 65 plus population, which is the most vulnerable population, and that's a really key insight to factor into the plan in addition to the other two variables that we discussed earlier. So this graph really just highlights that, and I want to mention how important that is to the overall medical staffing plan. So, in addition to our top 5 states, we talked about the other states and their demand for our services. And this graph does a really good job of highlighting that. So you can see how the states are shaded different colors. They're all different shades of red. The darker shade, the closer they are to the darkest shade of red, as we can see in the legend on the right, the higher average flu deaths per year in that state. So California has the largest number. It's going to be the darkest shade of red. You can also see the bubbles. Not only the size of the bubble, but the shade of green within the bubble. The larger the bubble and the darker the shade of green within the bubble indicates the larger average 65 plus population for that state. So as you can see, we're looking at averages in this graph. This gives us a really good understanding of where the averages in those variables lie from 2009 to 2017, so we can just have an understand for where the general demand for our services lies nationwide. Now we can see from this graph that the Northeast has a couple things that indicate demand. Larger 65 plus populations, and also some of the states are shaded more red, which means that there's going to be a higher average death count during flu season. We can also see here in the Southeast that we have a similar relationship with regards to a larger average 65 plus population. We can also see some darker shading in the states, which will indicate more flu deaths as well during the season on average. In the Midwest, you can also see that we're going to have more larger numbers of 65 plus population and more flu deaths as well. We can also see isolated Texas and California have really high numbers of both of those variables. Now, there's two things that I want to point out on this graph that are either a compliment to states or a cause or concern for the states, and I'm going to guess it's a blend of both. We just don't know why. So you can see in kind of the West, there is a really low average death by flu per year, and also a really low average 65 plus population. Now that second point, average 65 plus population, that's going to be a census count thing. So for all we know, they really have a lower number of 65 plus people. That could be a really good indicator that we don't need to send as many services up there. However, you're going to have a state like Alaska, and I'm going to highlight Alaska real quick. I'm sorry, it's taking a while to load. Here we go. When we get to Alaska, we can see that their average 65 plus population is a little over 57,000 people a year, and yet their average sum of deaths from flu from 2009 to 2017 is 0. Now, I find it hard to believe that not one person has died from flu from 2009 to 2017 in Alaska. Whether, people from Alaska have traveled continental United States or vice versa, it's going to spread up there in some way, shape, size, or form. I do believe that. So I believe that Alaska may be underreporting their flu deaths to the CDC. And this can have a detrimental impact on medical staffing in a state like Alaska, because we're not going to know to send staff up there because we have not been informed through the data that they need our staff. So this is just something that is key to point out, and it's really important for all states, especially if they feel like they're being understaffed. Well, how are you doing when it comes to reporting your death counts during flu season? And we'll get to that more in the data limitations at the end of the presentation. All right. So really appreciate you guys and gals joining us today. At this stage, we're going to be summing things up with some recommendations, next steps, and data limitations to really stress what we need moving forward to have a more effective medical staffing plan for the years to come. So with regards to recommendations, we've identified some key demand centers. We know that California, Texas, the Northeast, the Southeast, and the Midwest are going to have a greater demand for our services based upon the data. And so we believe sending staff to states with historically high death counts from flu, larger 65 plus populations, and those with higher historic death rates, like Vermont, are key indicators for where to send our staff. With regards to the next steps, We believe that it would be wise to create an awareness campaign for both states and hospitals on the importance of reporting flu deaths accurately and timely during and at the end of flu season. And we believe this campaign should be multi-tiered, so we introduce it at the beginning of flu season, we remind them in the middle, and we remind them at the end. Because as we have seen in states like Alaska, if you do not report flu deaths and you have a very low 65 plus population, then we don't have key performance indicators that tell us to send staff to your state. And so that likely could lead to instances of understaffing, and that's one of the key things we're trying to avoid with this analysis. Another next step that we as our team came up with is to run an analysis of historical medical staffing trends by state and nationwide. So where have we been historically over and understaffed? We do acknowledge that there could be some data privacy limitations, and there also could be some limitations when it comes to HIPAA and privacy concerns. Again, we're talking to hospitals, state health organizations on this call, and we are a private entity at the Medical Staffing Agency, and so there's a lot of privacy and HIPAA concerns that could create a complication with this idea. But we still need to find a way to communicate over and understaffing within the organizations so we can reduce instances and be more accurate in doing so. And finally, here are a couple graphs to leave you guys and gals with. First off, on the left, on the bottom left, we have flu deaths by state from 2009 to 2017. And this is going to be sent to everybody. You can go down, see where your state ranks. One recommendation I have for a next step is these states that have lower numbers, take a little more time to educate them on the importance of reporting flu deaths. That could really show some good change here. So that's on the left. On the right, this is again something that I mentioned is really important that doesn't show in the volume of flu deaths and the volume of 65 plus populations. And this is that we need to consider states with higher rates of death from flu, especially in the 65 plus population. So Vermont is a huge outlier in this regard. It's really important to point out New York, for example. They're one of the largest sums of 65 plus populations, one of the largest sums of flu deaths on average every year, and now they have one of the highest rates, the second highest rate of flu death in their 65 plus population. Well, they're going to need a really unique medical staffing plan because they're so high in all key areas compared to the rest of their peers. So hopefully this analysis has gleaned some insight into our plan moving forward for next year and the future. We do encourage communication, and so we will be sending this out to all members on this call, and we will be encouraging feedback, not only right after this call, before flu season, during flu season, and after flu season, because we realize getting this dialed in and cleaned up can give us a much better plan moving forward and give us much more strength as we go out there and fight flu. Thank you guys for joining us today. It was a pleasure presenting to you, and let's get out there and do some good work.